Welcome to Longform, the podcast produced by Jadaliyya. Our inspiration for these discussions is the well-known quote by Antonio Gramsci. The old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters. I'm Bassam Haddad, and together with my co-host Mu'in Rabbani, we are exploring this theme with a series of guests whose work has provided valuable insights into these issues. For this episode, we're delighted to be speaking with the award-winning author and journalist Omar El Akkad. His debut novel, the international bestseller American War, has received or been nominated for over a dozen prizes and has been translated into more than a dozen languages and is described by the BBC as one of the 100 novels that changed our world. His most recent book, published this year, is One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This. His first book-length work of nonfiction and an instant New York Times bestseller. It conveys El Akkad's reflections on Israel's genocidal campaign in the Gaza Strip and the collapse of Western liberalism's pretensions. Omar El Akkad, a very warm welcome, my friend, to long-form conversations. We're delighted to be with you and looking forward to our discussion. Ahlan wa sahlan.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Ahmed, it's very good to have you on the program, and we'd like to start with the same question we initially posed to all of our guests on this podcast. Are we experiencing a disintegration of the international order, or is this order experiencing yet one more of many challenges from which it is expected to recover and perhaps emerge even stronger than before?
I suppose one way or another we're going to find out. What's fascinating to me in that question is the amount of work that the word "we" is doing, because certainly when I think about the world order in which I personally have been complicit, and from which I personally have benefited greatly over the course of my life, by attuning myself to the West, by making myself sound like this, by learning this language, by culturally and socially and psychologically making myself acceptable, I'm thinking about a world order whose central sales pitch was about everybody's standard of living and quality of living sort of going up, right? And I think it's becoming more and more difficult to accept that is a reasonable payoff when the quality of life of somebody living in my part of the world that I live in right now in the West might include something like getting a faster iPhone every year, while someone in the Congo's standard of living rising might be making $1 more a month mining the raw materials necessary to make that iPhone. I think the powers of obliviousness necessary to believe that that's an even amount of progress for everybody involved in the equation is becoming more and more difficult to undertake. Certainly it is for me. I think that we were okay so long as this system was saving its harshest punishment for a certain group of people and saving its greatest rewards for another group of people. And now that it's glaringly obvious that that is the case, I think a certain facet of the system is falling apart.
Many people have described Israel's genocidal campaign in the Gaza Strip as a final nail in the coffin of the international order that was established after the Second World War and of the institutions that have underpinned it. What you've just said notwithstanding, do you agree with this assessment?
Certainly at no other point in my life have I come closer to agreeing with it. And it's not like the last 40 plus years haven't seen their fair share of atrocities. I think one of the most glaring differences in this moment is that, generally speaking, what has been said in the past implicitly is now being spoken quite explicitly. And what I'm thinking of here, and this relates to your previous question, I think, is this notion, for example, that things like international law and the International Court of Justice and these conventions and these rules with their rewards and punishments, specifically their punishments, have largely been siloed off to a certain group of people. And those aren't Westerners. That's not what the International Court of Justice is for. That's not what international human rights is for. That's the reason George W. Bush isn't sitting in The Hague despite 1 million dead Iraqis, right? And we know this. We all know this. It's not some epiphany that I'm sharing on your show that nobody's aware of. We've all known implicitly that there are certain consequences and certain chains of events and chains of fundamentally justice that quite simply don't apply to the winning side. And again, I think previously people as cowardly as myself would have had the powers of dissociation necessary to live with that, to accept it. But this last year and a half has been far, far more explicit. You've had explicit genocidal statements, the kind of stuff that should land you in that court. And seeing it not happen and seeing these people welcomed over and over again to state dinners and events has just made it a little too explicit, I think, to believe in that order as a performative thing, when clearly in practical terms it's not functioning.
But I'd still like to press you on what exactly is so exceptional about this event. I mean, you mentioned George W. Bush in Iraq. You yourself have covered the war in Afghanistan and the prison system in Guantanamo Bay. And for that matter, numerous other illegal wars, occupations, and genocide since 1945. Help us understand what is so different or exceptional about Gaza when compared to these other cases that you have reported and written about directly yourself, or that you're familiar with.
I think two things come to mind. The first is that I think every generation has their version of this moment. I've been on book tour for 2.5 months, mostly in the US and Canada. And I can't tell you how many Vietnam veterans have shown up to these events to talk to me. And so I think there's an element of exactly what you're talking about here, of this not being new, but it being new for particular generations. So that's one facet of it. And I think that's part of the reason why so much of the most vehement opposition that you're seeing right now is on college campuses. It's with folks who weren't alive for Vietnam and who can barely remember the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. But the second thing that comes to mind is that people far braver than myself came to these conclusions at every moment that you just described. During the invasion of Afghanistan, during the slaughter in Iraq, watching the images out of Guantanamo Bay and that invented court system that was there and that continues to be there. I think this moment in particular, there is a kind of intensity and a kind of intimacy that, at least in my lifetime, feels different. Now, I might be completely wrong there, and people would disagree, maybe. But waking up every morning and seeing images of children who've had their limbs amputated without anesthesia, of watching and hearing and seeing these stories and this grotesque atrocity time and time and time again, and knowing that if you live in this part of the world, you are paying for this, you are doing this, and knowing that you will be told by virtually every system of power and institution of power in your society that if you stand against this, you are the bad person in this equation. It induces a kind of break. And maybe for other people that break came earlier, it came in different moments. But I've never in my life encountered so many people who have simultaneously decided, if this is the price of admission, I don't want in. And so that's what I think the distinction is. But I don't discount for a moment that many, many other people watching the bodies in Iraq, for example, wouldn't have come to the same conclusion. This just feels more intense, more immediate, and more difficult to sever one's complicity from than anything I've experienced in my lifetime.
If I could just again zoom out to the more general question, if our system is being transformed by us, by others, for themselves, however you want to frame it, what's next?
I don't like to reduce the world to these sort of simple binaries, even though I'm a fairly simplistic person, so the lure is always there. I can't deny it. To me, in the most general terms imaginable, it comes down to one of two things. It comes down to a world where there is no gap between the performative nature of our institutions of power and justice and the practical aspect. What I mean by that is that I live in a country where every day for a year and a half, I woke up to listen to a State Department spokesperson talk about the desire for everlasting peace as the same administration funded an endless campaign of slaughter on the other side of the planet, one of many over the years and over the decades. That's a gap. We either close that gap such that, for example, we have an international court of justice and international human rights law that apply to everybody equally, such that it isn't this incredible anomaly if someone like George W. Bush is held to account, in which case we will have a far more just society, but it will be justice for everybody. Or we end up with what is shaping up currently around the world, including the United States, which is this slide into outright fascism. It's this counter argument that says, listen, we're sick of you putting on the costume of someone who pretends to care about everybody, of someone who cares about trans rights, immigrant rights, and while simultaneously passing policies that traumatize and destroy these people's lives. We're sick of that. We're just going to close the gap in the other direction. We are no longer going to have the performance of even caring about these people. We're going to actively destroy their lives. And if you get in our way, we're going to destroy your life, which is the defining facet of this administration that I currently live under. There is no gap between the performance and the reality, with the exception of nonsense, press events that everybody knows is an outright lie, where you bring out the kid who's suffering from cancer while you simultaneously cut all cancer funding. In the reality of the statements themselves, there is no longer even the performance of caring about vulnerable populations. Now it is time to destroy them. And I think we're at this fork in the road, and we have to choose. The idea of kicking it further down the line and having someone else deal with it is coming to an end. We either make these systems of justice and systems of power work for everybody, or we admit that what we want is the Donald Trumps of the world. And we want someone who's not us to suffer until the not us becomes us and it's too late to do anything about
it. Omar, I would like to move to a discussion of your book. This is, of course, something that is very unique, because when I first saw the title, it was precisely what I had been thinking about, because of the unfathomable reality that there were people that were still supporting the genocide at a time when it was evident that, in retrospect, everyone is going to sort of shed those positions. Can you first tell us what motivated you to write the book? And what are the main points you wanted readers to take from it? And if there was a transformation at all in the process of writing, whereby you were going somewhere, but then you ended up, tangentially or in a minor way or a major way, switch course.
But before you do so, Omar, if I could just read the tweet that you published in October of 2023 that received over 10 million views, and that is a source of the title of this book. And specifically, you wrote, "One day, when it's safe, when there's no personal downside to calling a thing what it is, When it is too late to hold anyone accountable, everyone will have always been against this.
So, like I mentioned earlier, I'm not a particularly intelligent or eloquent person. I tend to think in terms of pattern recognition, and this tweet was in late October, I think, of 2023. By which point, I think anyone who didn't have a vested interest in not seeing what was happening was seeing what was happening, and I think we all sort of knew in one way or another where this was headed. And so to me, I didn't think there was anything particularly profound about that statement. To me, it seemed a matter of historical fact based on what I do a lot of the time, which is, again, this sort of pattern recognition. I was thinking about how it's very difficult in the United States to find somebody who will tell you that they had previously supported segregation, for example, or to find a South African who'll tell you that they were a proud supporter of apartheid. And it's not because those people don't exist. They certainly do. They just keep those opinions locked away because it's not socially acceptable to have them anymore. I'm a writer, so I go to a lot of literary festivals, and every one of them at this point tends to begin with these land acknowledgments. We acknowledge that we are on the unceded territory of the indigenous people of this part of the world. The first time that I heard one of those in the United States was when I said it at an event, because in Canada they had started doing this much earlier. And I remember everyone in that audience looking at me like I was from outer space. What is this guy doing? And within a few months, maybe a year, it was essentially at every literary festival that I went to in the United States. There's this notion of, where are we right now? And what do we have to do to meet the level of social acceptability? And right now, we're not there yet with respect to polite Western society and the slaughter of Palestinians. But there's no doubt in my mind that that trajectory is going to follow the same arc. It may not happen in my lifetime. I think some people have read this title and thought that I meant next week, when we're talking about an occupation that's been going on for 3/4 of a century. I don't think that's the case. I think it's going to take a very, very long time. But nonetheless, that option is always available for the thick middle of people who don't give a damn about Israelis or Palestinians, who can't point out any of these places on a map, who simply don't care. They just want to know what the acceptable position to hold is at any given moment. And at some point, it is going to be the case that everyone will have to have always been against this. I don't tweet that often. I didn't tweet that often back then. I don't tweet at all now. I'm not really on social media anymore. So I didn't really predict or understand that this thing would get the traction that it did. But the writing of the book was independent of that. The book was originally titled The Glass Coffin, and it was only after the first draft was completed many months later that one of my editors suggested repurposing the phrase from the tweet. But I promise you that I didn't just take a tweet and sort of stretch it out to 280 pages. That wasn't the writing process for whatever that's worth.
What was a glass coffin?
I was thinking about the idea of when a certain segment of the population is considered subhuman, and when anything can be done to them with no repercussions, with no consequences. One of the last vestiges of actual power that segment of the population has is to show the body, to simply show what the bombs do, what the bullets do. And I was thinking of, not just in the case of Palestinians, but in the case of every population that has been subjected to state-sanctioned brutality, how this is a recurring moment that induces so much anger on the part of the person or the entity or the institution doing the brutalizing. How dare you show the body? How dare you put the body in a glass coffin? This is true of the civil rights movement in the United States. This is true of every atrocity in recorded history, recorded being the central term here because there is some accounting of what happened. And so that was the original thought, because I was writing this book in the fall of 2023. And repeatedly, this is still the case today, but repeatedly then, the rage was at the images. How dare you show this, right? We've all heard this. We've all heard the stuff about, Pallywood, I think they call it, which is this notion that the Palestinians are just making this up, that these kids didn't really have their limbs blown off their bodies, that this never happened, which again is a defining psychological trait of every atrocity. This didn't actually happen. And so that's where that originally came from.
Omar, Mohin, if you would like to ask something else, go ahead. But I wanted to ask Omar if he could read or select a passage to read from the book.
Yeah, let's start with that.
Sure, yeah. So I usually read from the prologue because it's pretty standalone, but I'm going to read something else this time. There's a section of this book. I mean, you asked earlier, and I think I dodged the question, so I should answer it now, about things changing in the book. Fundamentally, at an overarching level, very, very little change thematically or in terms of orientation, but I was making little changes throughout. That's largely for two reasons. One is there were elements of just factual, things that would come out and be presented as facts and then immediately turn out to be outright lies, and so I would have to sort of change it based on that. But the other part was that I realized that I was sidestepping my own complicity in all of this, and so a lot of the book had to become, I think, more autobiographical in terms of addressing that, because at the end of the day, I'm killing those kids, right? I'm doing that. My tax money is doing that, and this is just a very short segment about just how daily life kind of changes, how the run of the days changes when you can't look away from that anymore. More and more, daily life seems to invert. The very consequential work of figuring out taxes and filing stories and handing students their essays back becomes utterly trivial. When I'm offered a book deal, my friend asks how we're going to celebrate, and for a moment I genuinely believe he's joking. Spousal arguments, contract negotiations, deadlines, everything sheds its veneer of importance. The only thing that seems paramount is to spoil my kids. I decline most professional invitations, events, assignments, panels where I know I'll be the token brown guy. But then I'm invited to an awards ceremony in Los Angeles. Having just gone on a radio show a day earlier to berate other artists for not having the guts to use their acceptance speeches to call for an end to the genocide, I feel like a hypocrite if I don't go. I stand in a ballroom amid hundreds of cheerful, celebratory people, and it occurs to me I've lost the ability to be here. I have spent the entirety of my life stitching together costumes to make Westerners feel at ease in my presence. A massive internal compendium of cultural references and jokes and shorthand and all these alternate means of saying, "Don't worry, I'm not foreign, I'm like you." And suddenly, I've run out of things to wear. The defining emotion, as it has been for months, is bewilderment. What is wrong with me that I can't keep living as normal? What is wrong with all those people who can?
Wow. I'd like to connect that passage with the glass coffin, if I may. You talk about a sense of personal complicity. You talk about outrage by the perpetrators for having to see the results of their atrocities. But at the same time, people refer to this as the first live-streamed genocide. I mean, it's arguably the largest glass coffin in history. And in addition to that, the perpetrators, which I don't think is particularly unique in the case of Gaza, are openly celebrating and bragging about their atrocities. Perhaps the difference is that many more of us are seeing it than we would have otherwise. In Abu Ghraib, it took a leak of photographs to find out how much the torturers enjoyed doing their work. When you consider that, given your earlier statement that an unprecedented number of people are kind of opting out, and there is a sense of personal complicity, and there is this glass coffin, do you also have any prescriptive recommendations about where we go next? Do we stop paying our taxes? What 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 conclusions do you draw from everything you've described, or do you not consider it your role and function to draw such conclusions?
Yeah, I think this more than anything is the question that I spend the most time on, both in the book and in my daily life, to be perfectly honest. And that's for two reasons. The first is that I'm, again, a coward about it. But the second is that even the people I meet, and I've met a lot now because of this book and because of, touring for it and sort of the interactions that come of that, I've met a lot of people who are not cowards, who are doing the work. And even they are uncertain. And so to give you a sense of what I'm talking about, the last event of the Canadian tour was in Vancouver. It was at the Vancouver Public Library. And a little while prior to my arrival there had been some staff members at the Vancouver Public Library who had been wearing watermelon pins or keffiyehs. And I guess someone complained and said, this makes me feel unsafe or something like that. And so the library used a rule that they have that I think they'd only previously employed twice. Somebody had worn a badge advocating violence or had worn an anti-trans badge or something like that. And they used the same rule to effectively silence all of these library staff. And then they started to pretzel themselves into this ridiculous position of, well, you can wear it if you're Palestinian and you speak Palestinian Arabic. And I'm not sure who on the Vancouver Public Library Board is going around doing Arabic language and tests or what. It was nonsense, right? The whole thing was nonsense. And so in the lead up to my event, I get contacted by this group of activists who had been protesting this. And they're like, hey, we just want to let you know this is happening. And I said, thanks for letting me know. What can I do? And then there was real sort of, back and forth and uncertainty about, well, do we boycott the event? Do I show up and then use my platform and use the room to call for something to be done about this, to call for it to be overturned? And there was no consensus, right? Because, again, and I come back to this in the book, the work of imagining something better than this is by definition infinite. There is no ceiling on it. You and I are sitting here, we're trying to imagine a better world. Maybe you want to burn everything to the ground and start with a brand new system. And maybe I just want to tax billionaires a little bit more. We have a tiny bit of common ground, but the ceiling is unlimited, right? Whereas if the system works for you, you don't have to do a damn thing. You don't have to imagine anything better. In fact, you can use your infinite imagination in a negative sense to imagine how much worse society would be if we ever tried to improve things. And so for me, it comes down to this notion that, particularly in moments like this, in moments where the atrocity is so grotesque and so overwhelming and so celebrated by the perpetrators, everything matters. And I split it into active resistance and negative resistance. Active resistance is all those people who are chaining themselves to the gates of weapons manufacturers, who are doing the work, who are sitting in the encampments in universities being brutalized by their own universities. And negative resistance is when you don't participate, when you don't buy, when you don't engage. And they each serve a purpose. And I think all of it is fair game right now. But this idea that there's an algorithmic approach, do this and then something better will come about, has been proven to me time and time again, both historically and in this moment, to be a pipe dream. Because we are trying to imagine a better world, and that better world doesn't exist yet. And so I see tons of infighting among the people doing the most important work, and I see tons of exhaustion, because it's so much easier to just say the system as it exists is the best we can ever do, and so I wash my hands of it. anything that's not that, I think, is in the long run beneficial.
Omar, before we go on, I would like us to sort of pry open the book and have you tell us a little bit about what's going on in there. So I'm going to shift screen and you'll see on this.
Bassam, you've muted.
Now you're back.
So you'll see on the right-hand side of the screen the book as actually it is featured. So I'll just go page by page. Don't worry, I'm not going through the whole book, just the beginning and the table of contents mainly. Just asking you if you'd like to comment on any aspect to begin with. This also says that you have two other books, American War and What Strange Paradise.
Both novels.
Absolutely. And this is, of course, the copyright. These are the quotes you chose, I'm assuming, to place at the outset. One by Tayyib Saleh from the famous Season of Migration to the North, and another by Wisława Szymborska. Can you tell us why you selected those quotes?
Yeah, the Tayyib Saleh quote has stuck in my mind for a very long time, ever since I first read that book. Obviously, within the Arab world, that book has a kind of, mythical status. It shows up quite often when people talk about some of the best sort of, modern novels or whatever time frame you want to put it in.
Could I interrupt and ask Omar, could you please read out that quote, or if you prefer I do so, please do.
Sooner or later, they will leave our country, just as many people throughout history left many countries. The railways, ships, hospitals, factories, and schools will be ours, and will speak their language without either a sense of guilt or a sense of gratitude. Once again, we shall be as we were, ordinary people, and if we are lies, we shall be lies of our own making. So, to me, one of the things about that novel, one of the really magnificent things about it, is that besides being this incredible act of inversion, it also feels like it could have been written last week. I mean, you go back and read that book, and there's a precision to it. There's a precision as to how it handles these deeply asymmetric relations that I think makes it timeless. And I know that word is thrown around with respect to literature quite often, but this is one of those moments and one of those books where I think it is apt. And so it stuck with me because I'm someone who for the rest of my life will speak their language. And in fact, one of the reasons that I've been rewarded so much in life in terms of my career, in terms of my sense of personal safety, is the way I sound. I have relatives who have the same names as me, who look the same, all the rest of that, but they don't have this accent. And the way they are treated in this part of the world is entirely different. And so I was thinking about these things when I picked that quote. And the other one is from a poem called Vietnam, which is a very short poem. And it's just a series of questions and answers between a soldier and this person who has survived a massacre, effectively in a village in Vietnam. And the rest of the lines, the answer is, I don't know. Where is everybody? I don't know. Where are you from? I don't know. All of that. And then we get to the final line of the poem, which is this line. Are those your children? Yes. And I think a lot of the book for me is about this notion that one of the most terrible privileges of living on the launching side of the missile is coming to this belief system in which there exists some such a thing as someone else's children. There is no such thing as someone else's children. And that has been the defining thought in my mind every day for the last year and a half as I wake up and watch someone else's children be torn limb from limb.
Thanks, Omar. I'm going to go on. And this is essentially what I also wanted to focus on, which is the table of contents. For somebody who's, recommended even at the time this book. But if you can just tell us a little bit about the chapters. There are 10 chapters. First called Departure, second Witness, third Values, fourth Language, fifth Resistance, sixth Craft, seventh Lesser Evils, eighth Fear, ninth Leave Taking, and then 10th Arrival. Did they impose a word limit on you for chapter titles? No, I'm joking. But I actually do need to learn from you, because my chapter titles basically makes you not want to read the chapter because you've read it in the chapter title. So I appreciate that sort of concision. If you can just tell us a little bit, you don't have to go through every chapter, but if you can tell us why you broke it down this way, and what are some of the things you'd like us to take away from this breakdown.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always interesting structurally, right? Because when you're putting together a book structurally, it's equal parts sort of very scientific intent. This is what I want to do, and so on and so forth. And then the book fighting back and saying, no, you idiot, this isn't going to work for the following reasons. And I ended up in this structural mode where every chapter begins with this kind of defining one word statement of intent, basically. And then there's a section in italics that is very much of the present moment, of the present atrocity, but also bleeding into the 75-year history, at the very least, of the moment we're in. And then there's another section that is very personal and autobiographical. And then there's a breakdown of whatever it is that I had started the chapter with in terms of intent. There's certain chapters that are much more standalone. The craft chapter, for example, comes from this sense of deep uncertainty I had about what it means to do the work I do, what it means to call yourself a writer, or to say that you're engaged in the work of literature, in a moment where it feels so petty, and everything feels so petty relative to the grotesqueness of what you're seeing all around you. And so there's certain chapters that read like standalone essays more than others, I suppose. But generally speaking, I was thinking about this notion of who the hell we are on the other side of this. I don't know what the last year and a half has been like for the both of you, or for anyone else really. But I have come untethered from the person I was before this. Because the person I was before this was on board for a lot of these things that I indict or interrogate in this book. And I can't do it anymore. And so I know it reads like this collection of arguments, like I'm trying to pick a fight or anything like that. It's not. I don't care about who I argue with anymore. I don't want to argue with anyone anymore. I don't care about changing someone's mind. To me, it's a deep uncertainty that runs throughout the book. And that's the thread that I think connects what are otherwise often quite sort of divergent chapters. But that's how I sort of held it all together structurally as best I could.
Might I say something along the lines of what you just shared, and that is how there were certain things in life, in your life, in our lives, that we valued, and then that has somehow acquired a very different value after this genocide. And I personally experienced this and kind of belittle myself a little bit here and there, sometimes more than a little bit, regarding some of the things that I used to care about a lot. not that there was something, egregiously wrong with that, but somehow the genocide, reordered the value of things. So I just wanted to resonate with what you're saying, unless you meant something different.
No, I don't think I did. I think that's exactly it. I mean, I was teaching this class, this virtual craft class. We're talking about sentence structure and all this stuff that I love to nerd out about. I mean, I'm a huge language nerd, but at the same time as I'm teaching it, I got my phone next to me, and one of my closest friends from high school, who at the time had moved back to Lebanon, was a Lebanese friend of mine. We're going back and forth where I'm trying to keep him calm as he's trying to keep his kids calm because his kids are freaking out because there's fighter jets overhead. And they don't know if their building is going to be bombed next. And you're sitting there and you're thinking two things, right? The first is, I live in a part of the world where I'm afforded a narrative that could fix all of this immediately. If one of those bombs drops on my friend's house, on my friend's apartment building, which is that, this was good and proper and necessary, and probably my friend was Hamas or whatever, Hezbollah, whatever I need to do to make all of this work out. But the second thing I'm thinking is like, what the hell am I doing? I'm teaching these students about run-on sentences and the emotional appeal of the occasional run-on sentence and heightening the emotional resonance of a piece. What the hell is this? What are we doing? And there's been moments like that in every facet of my life, every facet. And I don't know that there's any going back from that, to be honest. But who knows? Who knows what the next years are going to bring?
If I may, I know, Mu'in, you're dying to interject.
No,
it's okay.
not at all.
I mean, if I may, just address this with you just for a moment. There are things like the run-on sentence that will, whose value will be restored at some point in the future, because we need to teach that or teach against that. So this is one of the things in the order of values that has changed at the moment, but that will actually have its place restored. But I think there are things that will never be restored because in and of themselves were not as valuable as we ever thought. I just wanted to make that distinction because I struggle with this myself. In other words, when we say when the genocide subsides, because we don't say ends because it's not going to end. It's going to transform into incremental genocide given what's happening in the West Bank and what will continue to happen in Gaza at some level. But when the genocide subsides, there are things that we might not ever go back to. I don't think the run-on sentence and the other things that I feel you and I see what you're saying and I felt the same way. But there are other things that I'll go back to, yet some things I don't think we will. And I think that's going to have a profound impact on us individually and maybe us as a society, wherever one is. So I just wanted to flag that. But tell me, please, if you take issue with that.
No, I don't think I could disagree with a word of that. I think you've said it far more eloquently and succinctly than I ever could.
That was a run-on sentence. Omar, for our last topic, I'd like to shift gears a bit, but not entirely, since both you and Bassam have just referred to the years ahead of us. And I'd like to take as a starting point your first novel, American War, which is about a fictional second U.S. Civil War far in the future. You wrote that, I think, before Trump won his first election, and you completed it before 2017. But when you look at what you wrote then from the vantage point of today, how would you reflect on what was intended as a work of fiction when you wrote it? And, without getting into, let's say, individual plot lines and things that one would hope are too fantastical to ever become reality. Nevertheless, the issues of polarization and so on um, uh, that you centered in many ways in your novel. How do these look from the vantage point of 2025, from the beginnings of the second Trump administration?
It's interesting because when people pick up the new book, when they pick up One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This, there is an obvious sort of lure to think of it as the Israel-Palestine book, and obviously it would not have been written, certainly not in the form that it ended up being in, were it not for the last year and a half. But I do think of it overwhelmingly as a book about here, as a book about the West. Whereas conversely, I would tell people I did write an Israel-Palestine book. It was called American War, and very few people read it in that context, right? There's a story in the book that I think I put it in One Day, that I go back to all of the time, because to me it's one of the sort of defining examples from my career of how there's the book you wrote, and then there's the many books people read. Your book goes through this kind of prism and becomes a million different things. And it has to do with the middle of American War, which takes place in this refugee camp for displaced Americans during this, Second Civil War. And it's called Camp Patience, and everything that happens in Camp Patience, particularly the culminating event of that section of the book, is based on Sabra and Shatia and the massacre that took place there some 40 years ago. Sabr, patience, that's where that comes from. But in the US, when I would do book clubs, I would constantly get asked, why did you have to make that section so brutal? And I would explain that it was based on historical events that actually happened. And then I do an Egyptian book club, and they immediately get the reference. And the first question is, if this is based on Sabra and Shatia, why did you tone it down so much? They had read an entirely different book. And so I've come to terms with that over the years, because American War for me was never an American book. It was a superimposition of another people's story onto the heart of the empire, which is an inversion of how this usually works. Usually it's the empire superimposing its stories onto everywhere else in the world, and we get Casablanca or, something like that. And so that's how I thought of that book. And then, 3 weeks after I finished the first draft, Donald Trump announced he was running for president, and the book ends up coming out 4 months into the Trump administration, and is now thought of exclusively as a prediction of where this country is headed. I think one of the really interesting things for me between that moment and 2015 through to 2017 to now, basically 10 years later, is that in both cases I've sort of ignored that interpretation because it wasn't how I intended to write the book. But previously, the book also ignored that interpretation. And now I look at the contents of that book, and I look at the moment we're in, and I can't fully discount the possibility that purely through happenstance, purely through no sort of talent or intent of my own, that book is becoming aligned with a potential future of this country in a way that previously I thought would never be the case. That's fascinating to me conceptually, but has so little to do with the book I wrote versus the moment that it came out in.
Yeah, and that was precisely my point. Is quite clearly you were not reflecting on realities in the United States when you wrote that book, and it was a novel, like you said, based very much on the experiences that you had elsewhere, primarily in the Middle East. But now it's interesting that you're saying there's today a different way of looking at that book, and perhaps as a concluding question, I mean, we do have now this bizarre situation in the United States where you can actually be very critical of the U.S. government. It's considered legally acceptable to boycott the U.S. government, to have all kinds of views and positions about it. But I think the U.S. is somewhat unique in being the only country where it's more dangerous to criticize or boycott a client state, Israel, than the country itself. It's almost like you have to be more loyal to Israel than you do to the United States. When you look at these, anti-BDS laws, the current campaigns against the student movement, and so on. So I'd like to ask you, perhaps, to conclude with your views about that and how it ties into both the themes explored in your new book and the growing polarization in the United States.
I mean, I think that there's a number of things going on here that lead to that kind of situation. There's various groups in the United States whose support for Israel, or the project that Israel is undertaking, is so ironclad, and they're in some cases very different sort of motivations, right? I mean, you have the evangelical Christian conception of the second coming and this notion that this is necessary to that sort of conclusion, which, again, I heard someone say once that it's impossible to reason somebody out of a position that they didn't reason themselves into to begin with. And so I tend to not want to pick an argument with somebody who is firmly of the belief that we need to let this happen because Jesus will come back when it does. I'm not going to we exist on opposite sides of a particular chasm that I'm not going to be able to bridge. I think there's some, particularly within the political ranks of the United States, who don't give a damn about any of this, who will just do whatever is politically most expedient at any moment. And they are the ones who the title of the book, I think, is most immediately applicable to. But then I also think that there's many people who are fully on board with the idea of the settler colonial project, who firmly believe in their hearts that there are the civilized and there are the savage, and that the civilized firmly have essentially carte blanche to do whatever they want to the savages, because that is in the name of civilization, that this worldview exists, and it exists among many in the present administration. I want for a second, though, to set all of that aside and to set all of these motivations and intents and whatever it is that brings somebody to that position aside, and to just think about the fundamental insatiability of the kinds of projects and the kinds of ordering of society that bring us to this moment. There is something truly insatiable about this process of endless taking, the taking of the land and the taking of the resources and the taking of the lives of anybody who gets in the way. And it is not existing in some kind of silo in Palestine. You can go find the images of the settlers in the country that I now live in and what was then indigenous territory and is now this nation, where they are deliberately starving the buffalo to death. Right, where they are deliberately killing off the buffalo to starve the indigenous population to death. This notion of there being some kind of endpoint, I think, is one of the most insidious narrative devices of the entire sort of settler colonial empire. That there is some point at which this all comes to a stop, and then everybody who remains will be rewarded for looking away from the unpleasantness. And I think it's so alluring, right? It's so magnetic that if I just keep my head down and have the bad stuff happen to those people who aren't me, I will get my endlessly faster iPhone, and I will get my Amazon packages delivered 20 minutes after I order them, and this will continue to happen. And for me, that is, in the long run, the most dangerous, existentially dangerous facet of the kind of ordering of the world that we've allowed to happen. These systems are insatiable. And right now we are watching it in the form of the Trump administration and who they choose to punish. But I promise you, they will start with the most vulnerable. They will start with trans folks and immigrants and the people they can hurt with the least consequences. And they will move to the less vulnerable. And then they will move to the people who didn't capitulate. And then they will move to the people who did capitulate. And then they will turn on themselves. Because there is no endpoint. There was never an endpoint. This is an insatiable kind of hunger. And if you believe that it ends when every last Palestinian is killed, or when every last member of this group or the other, it doesn't. It ends when there's none of us left. Because when there's the last two hyper-capitalists or hyper-colonialists left, they will turn on each other, and whoever wins will turn on themselves. Because they don't know how to do anything else. That, to me, is the thing we fight against at all costs. Because there is another ordering of the world, one in which we don't eat each other alive. And if it seems naive or improbable or hopelessly in the distance, it's only because our present way of thinking has conditioned us to make it so. I don't think any of that is true. And that's why I think of this book, for whatever it's worth, as the most hopeful thing I've written. Because every day I wake up and there is so much magnetic appeal to believe in that world where we just siphon and siphon and siphon until there's nothing left. I don't want to live in that kind of world.
Omar, I would like to ask you an impossible question.
And yeah, go for it. What the hell? The battery's about to run out of my computer.
I mean, look, your eloquence and your, the thoughtfulness that you are sharing with us, beyond any sort of description, like I want to be your friend. Anyway.
That's because you haven't known me for very long, but I appreciate it. Thank you.
I'm sure even if I knew you. So the question is, when will everyone become against this? Or what are the things that would have to happen so that this becomes a reality? And by everyone, I mean, I know that you don't mean every single person, because there are people still who support, the extermination of peoples, support the Holocaust, support apartheid South Africa, and actually there are people who are saying it, straight out in terms of South Africa. And long story, we can, maybe another time we'll discuss this issue. But when will this happen? What are the? Did you think about that aspect in terms of what will have to pass, how much will have to pass, and what will have to happen before this happens?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I don't think that's an impossible question, which is to say that, the title of this book is not ambiguous. One way or another, I'll be proven right or wrong. In time, we're going to find out if I'm way off here or not. But I want to exclude two groups from my answer. The first is the group of people that you've just mentioned, who are actively for this, who very much want to see these people wiped off the face of the earth and are open about it, and don't hide their intent, and probably won't for the rest of their lives. And those people, whatever you might say about them, are at least honest with themselves. Their hatred is not this little thing that they keep in a compartment that they try to hide away. So that's one group of people that I want to sort of exclude from my answer. The other group of people that I want to exclude, which I think is a much bigger group, are all the people who are against this right now, which, again, when I'm living in the United States, I tend to forget is the vast majority of the world. Everywhere I go on the planet, the amount of rage I see at what's happening is very difficult to describe. I was teaching in Qatar in November of last year. I go back to Qatar all the time because it's where I grew up, and any chance I get to go see, my high school friends or the house I grew up in, I'll take it. And I remember I was walking around a park, and they were having this little street festival, this kids festival or something like that. And there were all these food stalls. And next to the McDonald's food stall, there was this big washboard sign, and it said something like, "Attention, this McDonald's branch is owned by Sheikh whoever, and like is not affiliated with McDonald's." And it's because they were terrified, right? Because they knew the boycott, and they needed to, because they know what the people are thinking, right? They know what the vast majority of human beings in this place are thinking. So I want to exclude the group of people who are against this right now. And that leaves me with people for whom the defining facet of intellectual intention is what's socially acceptable. And so to come back to your question, I think that moment will come when everybody will always have been against this, when the plight of the Palestinian people is socially acceptable to include into the packet of mainstream liberalism. You know, I went to a reading recently in Portland where, as part of that land acknowledgement, the organizer also acknowledged the genocide of the Palestinian people. And I saw a couple of deeply uncomfortable liberals in that audience have to politely applaud at the end. And you can almost see in real time that this one issue that adheres to everything you say you believe as a liberal is now being shoved into the packet of things you have to agree with. And the whole thing is so fraudulent and feels so fraudulent, and nonetheless will become one of the defining sort of trajectory benders of this thing, when enough mainstream liberals decide that this particular people's suffering is acceptable to include in the kind of suffering that I personally, as a liberal, feel bad about. The whole thing is fraudulent, and yet nonetheless you see it happen all of the time. You saw it happen with race relations in the United States, with the plight and the genocide against the indigenous people, and you wait, and you wait, and you wait. And then it becomes part of the packet, and then something changes. And so to me, that is the group that I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about the title of this book.
I've always thought that even if everybody believes in the necessity of the freedom of Palestinians and Palestine, university presidents will not be on board. They'll be the last group on earth because they'll think that they will lose their jobs. Omar, thank you so much. I will leave it
Fantastic
to Mu'in to close or say
No,
whatever you'd like.
Yeah, on behalf of both of us in Jadaliyya, thank you so much for sharing your insights with long form conversation. We're awed by not only your eloquence but your personal integrity, and we've very much enjoyed speaking with you. Your book is already a New York Times bestseller, but we very much hope that particularly that group that you just mentioned will also have the courage to read your book and reflect upon the very salient points and moral issues it raises. Because as you said, it is a book that is more about here and what's happening here than it is about there.
Thank you so much. This was a privilege. I hope we get to do it again sometime. ألف شكرا يا جماعة. يلا مع السلامة.
Thank you. Assalamu.
Thank you so much, Omar. We'll be in touch.
Sounds good. Take care, guys. If you need anything else, give me a shout.
Thank you. Bye. Well, that was intense.
Absolutely. I really enjoyed this conversation, and in the beginning when he was speaking very softly, I was thinking,
where's this going?
Where's this going? In the sense that, there's a very powerful and bold statement that the book is making, but he went over and beyond. I mean, it was the thoughtfulness on his part is very moving.
Yeah.
I really appreciated this, and I don't want to sound like a jerk, but sometimes we go to these lectures and we have a lot of conversations, and it's it's very enriching, right? But it's not always that somebody's words and angles get you to think about that. You need to think about this and look at it again.
And he really does provide food for thought.
Absolutely, absolutely. So yeah, we have a couple more people that we are going to be speaking with soon. I'm not gonna divulge now in case they something happens and they can't do it. But yeah, we have a good number of people to
I
speak
know.
with.
Yeah. We do.
So all right, Moin. Always a pleasure to work with you.
Likewise, Bassam.
Yeah, absolutely.
We'll,
انتبه لحالك.
we'll meet again online soon.
شد الهمي. السلام عليكم.
عليكم السلام.
Bye.
Bye.